Okay, well, I had a little situation yesterday in which my brakes locked up because of a misadjustment and boiled away my brake fluid. And I had to buy brake fluid at a gas station, and they didn't have .4 brake fluid, so I ended up having to take .3 and put it into my brakes. And long story short, that meant I had to take everything apart and reassemble it, clean it and reassemble it. And I thought I would just make this little video for the good of the world, and like that. Okay, so this is the completely disassembled brake system from my KTM 350 EXC-F. It's a 2015 model, but I think they've used literally the exact same brakes for a decade or more around that. They're just these Brembo brakes, work very nicely, very simple, single piston caliper, floating caliper. And so anyways, I thought I would go through everything that has to go into disassembling, cleaning, and reassembling everything. So this is the brake caliper, and the brake caliper has a banjo bolt attachment here. There's a little tiny hole in the bottom, and that hole goes to inside the piston chamber here down there, and fluid, hydraulic fluid, travels back and forth between those two holes. And that hydraulic fluid is stored and fed from this, which is the master cylinder. It has the reservoir in it, and then this is the piston cylinder portion. And there's the viewing window to see whether you've got fluid in there at the right level, etc. And this is the rubber booty on the bottom that keeps water out of the piston area. This is the piston spring that is, I don't know if you can see that. Can you see that? I've got black gloves on. This is the piston spring, and this is the piston itself. The spring sits on top of that piston, and all of that is inside the piston chamber on the master cylinder. This is held in place through that slot there by this pin, which is screwed in through this hole, and that pin goes in there and holds the piston in place like that so it can't come out, and etc. And there are these two rubber bushings on this that show, well, let's see, can you see that? Where's the camera? They are flared slightly. They're not O-rings, and the upper one has some little tiny holes in the base. Those need to be in good condition. This upper portion, this has a little bit of springiness to it. Let's see. Maybe hear that. It moves back and forth a little bit. Inside of there is another little rubber bushing. So that all needs to be clean, and make sure there's no debris in there, no old brake fluid, no crustiness, nothing. And then this is the banjo bolt fitting, and this is the what do you call it? This is the bleed screw that allows it to be bled, and I think it would probably be better to call it the burp screw, because if you have kids, you know that when they're really little, if they've been fed, they need to be burped. They do not need to be bled. And the reason they need to be burped is that they get little tiny bubbles of air in their guts, and their guts are such small tubes at tiny size that they can't just burp it out easily. It doesn't just come up, and it hurts a lot when they get those little bubbles in there. And that's not why we care about having bubbles in our brake lines. It's because bubbles in the brake lines are compressible, and the whole point of having hydraulic fluid is that it is incompressible. And basically any fluid is incompressible if it's actually a liquid, not fluids, because air is a fluid. But in any case, any fluid, any liquid is incompressible. So why don't we just use water? Well, we could use water as a fluid, except that it has poor lubricating abilities and it tends to be corrosive, and it has a low boiling point. And the boiling point is very important in brakes because they get extremely, extremely hot. If you ever watch, for instance, Grand Prix motorcycle racing or auto racing at a very high level, they like to show you pictures of the brakes glowing red hot and shooting sparks off and like that. And those are carbon brakes, so they have to operate at a super high temperature or they don't work properly. Anyway, so we don't want water in the brake fluid because water will boil at 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees centigrade, and that isn't very hot as far as your brakes are considered. And .4 brake fluid will boil at a very much higher temperature than that, upwards of 500 degrees Fahrenheit, 200 some in Celsius. And that means that when the brakes get super hot, you still have a liquid throughout the entire system. Any place that you have a gas that is an air bubble or a bubble of vaporized fluid of whatever sort, it will provide an area that can be compressed. So when you step on your brakes, you end up compressing that bubble of gas instead of the fluid, and the gas bubble will compress, whereas the fluid won't. So the gas bubble compresses and it does not push this piston out of the cylinder to push the brake pads against the brake disc. So you don't get the effect that you're supposed to get. Let's see, where were we? Okay, so you have the master cylinder, you have the piston, you have the banjo bolts and the bleed screw. This is the cap for the master cylinder. There is an O-ring that seals that cap against the inside of this lip here. But this cap has these tiny little air grooves in it. You can see those, and they go to the inside of the cap. Maybe you can see that, hard to tell. And this bladder is inside the cap, resting in the brake fluid, and that bladder is there to allow the brake system to equalize to atmospheric pressure without being exposed to the atmosphere, because the atmosphere has water in it, and water is bad for brake systems because the water can boil. So that bladder rests on there, and I have to get it a little straighter than that, but in general it's good. And so that hole there and that hole on the other side allow this bladder to expand and contract if you go up to elevation or whatever. And this O-ring is what keeps the whole system sealed. So that bladder has to be on there, and this O-ring has to be on there, and then those need to be exposed to the air, and they need to be clean and not filled with dirt, etc. So if you periodically take your cap off, every time you do it, you should check to make sure that those little channels there are open and not sealed, and that this bladder is not full of water. If you ride through rivers or mud or whatever, that can all get messed up, right? And then this is just a little cap that goes over that bleed screw. This part is supposed to be in here to hold that whole system together and keep the end of that thing clean, because that's how you bleed the system when you're doing the brake bleeding. So for right now, I'll leave that off because I need to put these other parts together first. Ooh, it's hard to take it off when it's not in place. Okay, so those pieces go together, and that goes with that. And these are banjo bolt washers, and they are copper washers. They're malleable copper washers. They get smashed when you tighten the banjo bolt down, and they form a very good seal. You have to put quite a lot of pressure on them because the pressure inside the brake system is very high. If you stomp with your foot on the brake, you're putting an enormous amount of pressure in there. And so all of these things have to seal very well, or they just won't work. Okay, and then this is, as I showed before, this is the piston cylinder. So the brake piston goes inside of that, and in there are two grooves. Those grooves are filled by these two rubber gaskets, and those rubber gaskets are lubricated by the brake fluid itself. Nothing else goes inside the system except for brake fluid. No lubrication, no water, no soap, no anything. And by the way, how I cleaned all of this stuff is with warm soap and water. And that is fine because .4 brake fluid, not .5, but .4 and .3, which isn't used on motorcycles, brake fluid is hygroscopic. It is compatible with water, and it's hygroscopic, which means it absorbs water, why you have to keep it safe and not exposed to the atmosphere, and also why you need to have your brake fluid bottle sealed, etc. But because it absorbs the water in the system, you end up not having water separate inside of your system if it gets in there. So as water gets into the brake system more and more, which it just does inevitably, the brake fluid is compromised by having its boiling point lowered progressively. And if the brake fluid boils, that's bad. So that's why you need to bleed your brakes periodically, yearly, every other year, whatever it is, every 20 years in your GMC truck, and to get the water out and any air and debris and stuff out. This is the brake piston itself, and that fits inside that cylinder, inside the brake piston cylinder, with these rings as the seal. And so that brake piston moves very little actually in its duties, and there is no return spring. Nothing pulls the brake piston back in or pushes the brakes away from the sliding caliper away from the brake disc. It's just the reverse of pressure and the fact that the brake is not actively pressing on the disc that keeps it from dragging too much to be a problem. Okay, and then this little thing here is the anti-rattle clip, which snaps into the back of the brake caliper there, and that holds the brakes, these things, the brake pads, and is kind of a spring so that they don't rattle around too much. And then all of this fits onto the brake carrier, which is this thing, which has the other portion of the anti-rattle springs on it, and that all goes together like that. And then the brake pads fit in there, and they hook onto a little shelf in there, and they do like this, and then there's a pin which I've left downstairs in my garage that fits through there and holds these in place. so that they can slide and bounce around a little bit and move, and then but be kept where they need to be for when that piston pushes out and squeezes the brakes together. And that's what applying the brakes is. Okay, let me go get that pin. Okay, so I'm back. This is the pin, retainer pin. It has little holes in it that accept these retainer clips, which pass through that pin and hold everything in place. We'll get to that later when this is actually put together. So, for right now, can start reassembling this and narrating as I go along. So I have a can of brake fluid here, and I'm just going to put a tiny bit of brake fluid into the cap so I can dip my finger in it and lubricate these things with brake fluid as I put it all back together. Okay, so as I said before, these have been washed with soap and water, then they've been rinsed really super thoroughly, and then everything has been blasted out with compressed air. And if you don't have an air compressor, this might not be the job for you, but it really needs to be super clean and super duper dry. You don't want to go through all this trouble and then just end up with water back in the system because you didn't bleed it properly. So I'll start by putting this piston back into the master cylinder. So as I said, I'm just going to put a little bit of brake fluid onto all of these parts, the rubber seals, everything. This fluid is glycol based, which means I think it means it's similar to antifreeze. So that spring goes in there, and this, as far as I can tell, does not come off. This little rubber boot here. So this just needs to go in through that, and it's okay. It will in fact do that, as will this piston go through there, though it may not seem like it. I got it out, so I know it will go back in. And some human being somewhere in Austria or Italy or wherever it was made put this together, so I know that if they did it, I can do it. Okay, so this is nice and lubey, and I just have to push it in there and make sure that it all gets through. And I don't want to jam it up with this with the rubber boot, so I use one of my favorite tools. This is the tool that I use to get everything apart, all little O-rings and stuff taken out. And it is a hook, and it is pointy, but it's not actually sharp on the end, which is important, because if it's sharp like a dental pick, you can just tear things, and that's well, that's a big drag, and everything's wrecked. So getting this in there, oops. Okay, so now the spring is in there, it's rattling around, and to get this in there too, and that's just as much of a bore as getting the spring in, but it will in fact go in there because that's what it does. And if you have a hard time with this, it's because it's difficult. Don't worry. And by the way, that boot is there not to prevent anything from ever getting inside there, because this is actually open, and that's what I don't know what it's called, but it's that pivoting bolt brake adjuster thingy that's down there attached to the rear end of the pedal that is how you raise and lower your brake pedal for your particular setting. And so it's just to keep excessive stuff from getting in there. It's not like an atmospheric seal or anything like that. It's just to keep the stuff out. What really keeps stuff out is the rubber bushings that are on this piston. And yeah, it's fiddly about to get that thing to go past the boot there. Okay, so that's the first one past the boot. Then it has to go through the inside into the piston, and then the next layer, and at each step I'm having to pull this boot around the protrusions on the piston. And I like this hook instead of a dental pick, as I said, because I can move it around without very much fear of just randomly piercing the rubber, which would be a real nuisance. Especially since I can't see how it comes out of the brake master cylinder. I don't want to tear it, because then, as far as I know, I just have to buy a new master cylinder. I don't want to do that. Okay, that's past another one, and then there's just one more to go here. I find that by getting my tool in there first and then pushing the piston in, I can keep track of the edge of that boot, try to keep it from getting too far in there and pinching between the inside of the cylinder and the piston itself. Oops. But I lost contact with the outer edge there. Do this. Okay, now, so I've gotten that boot pinched in between this and the inside of the cylinder, so I have to come up with some way to pull this out a little bit and get back in it. I can push something down the inside, but remember there's that rubber, there's a little rubber gasket inside the bouncy bit that the spring goes around, so I got to get something to push that out a little bit. Okay, so I got in through this upper hole here in the piston chamber with a blunt pin and was able to just push on this a little bit and get it back out. So what I think I maybe need is a little more lubrication on this hood, and try to keep better track of it as I'm getting in there. Again, my pick here is not actually sharp. I mean, if you stab yourself with it, you could hurt yourself, but Finally, okay. So I got it in there. There's got to be a better way than that. Maybe somebody will post that in the comments. But that piston is now inside of there, and the boot is extending like it's supposed to, and you can see that there's no like actual seal to that. It's just there to keep crud out of there. All right, then to get the pin in, this pin which holds everything in place, and I'm going to put just a little brake fluid on that. It has to go in there, and then it has to find that slot in the middle. And I don't know if you recall, but on the end of the piston, there's these two lines. And so if those lines are, the piston has to be twisted to the right orientation, and those lines are how you do it. And okay, so those lines that are on the piston need to be oriented approximately in line with the mold axis of the piston in order for this pin to go through there. So that's how you can tell whether it's going to be in the right position when you get there. And then the piston has to go quite far inside the cylinder before that will happen. So if you're having trouble getting that pin in there, that's why, is because it's not far enough in there. Okay, and then this clamps down tight. It has some already has some Loctite on it, but that's what that that screw is for, is that holds that piston inside from moving too far. And again, so this is where the banjo bolt, this goes into that hole there, and it goes through the brake hose. So this hose has a little tiny hole in it through the banjo fitting. I don't know if you can, let's try and see if you can get it. Anyways, you'll see this obviously when you're in there. And this is a long tube that goes down the other end, attaches to the brake caliper. This is all full, and it's a very tight tube so that it can't expand, because if you press on the brake and you increase the pressure and this expands, then you don't get the brake feel that you want. You have to step harder on the brake to make it work than you should have to, etc., etc. So this banjo bolt has copper washers on both sides of the banjo fitting.